Hello, everybody. This is David Rovix with another of my periodic episodes of Discussions with David. And it is Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, which is the typical time for these discussions. And we're live right now on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, as well as Cable Community Radio. And it goes out in audio form afterwards if you look up This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts. And I am very happy to be spending the hour with Ryan Harvey, who has been one of my favorite songwriters and activists, organizers, writers for a very long time. We first met a very long time ago when he was actually a minor still. And I've been following his work for a long time, and there's a lot to talk about. And that is the very simple, short version of the intro. We'll get a lot more into the details as we go. Ryan, it's great to have you with us. And it's been so fun, like spending the morning exploring all sorts of things that you've been up to that I had not realized. Like, for example, that you have a podcast that you've been doing, a really great podcast, really well-produced podcast with all sorts of guests, knowledgeable guests about all sorts of things. And but I kind of was just having never interviewed you before that I can recall. I was just wanting to go through a kind of a life and times kind of hour fresh air style kind of starting early on when I first met you. And I mean your life and your forms of community. You've been involved with different forms of popular education and organizing basically for a very long time, and it corresponds kind of very neatly with a lot of the things I've been doing, and also a lot of the same social movements in a lot of the same countries, interestingly, that we've both been involved with. But starting with the global justice movement, which when I first met you in Washington, D.C., I believe you were 15 years old.
Sounds about right.
And and you were already a very extremely politically conscious and already playing music and writing songs, and I believe we met was it A16 or before then, somewhere around, or I don't know, but
it was either
around that time.
Yeah, it was A16, something around that. Yeah.
I wonder if I know this is like what was your childhood like kind of question, but how did you start up so at such an early age and with that kind of politically? I mean, were you growing up within the context of some kind of social movement or happening around you, or how did you get turned onto it at such an early age? It's
I guess happening around me would be the right way to put it. I mean, I definitely didn't grow up in a political household, but no, I think it was a combination of being a product of the late 90s and coming into sort of political consciousness through the punk rock scene at a time when, sort of right at the transition moment for those who come out of the punk scene, there was that transition moment between sort of the mid 90s, and punk rock was very, it's a lot of animal rights stuff. There was a lot of feminist stuff. There was a lot of just general anti-capitalism, but there wasn't a lot going on movement wise, except maybe in the animal rights scene and coming out of the environmental movement in the earlier 90s. But with the late 90s came the big wave of protests against the neoliberal agenda, and the punk rock scene really responded to that. So the bands that I was listening to, outside of like the typical punk rock bands a kid like me discovers, which thankfully included the Dead Kennedys and the Clash and not just the Sex Pistols, the local bands, though,
as great as the Sex Pistols are,
of course,
but what are some of the bands?
You get a little older and you're like, that's a pro-life song? Oh my God. Yeah, but I mean, bands
you can't analyze all of it too much, right? Especially,
that's true. That's true.
I mean, they wore
Johnny Rotten
to piss people
the
off,
image.
But,
but yeah, the bands that I was listening to around here in Baltimore were bands like Apolitical, this band called Chaotix. And, Apolitical, I'm like at their shows as a teenager, and they're in the summer of 1999, they're singing songs about the World Trade Organization and handing out flyers about how they're going to go to Seattle and be part of this thing. So
great.
being exposed to that, as well as some more popular, crust punk bands like Anti-Product and Os Rotten and some of these groups, that were sort of like the U.S. local versions of Crass and the Crass Records bands. But then Seattle happened, and I
Did
was
you make
paying.
it out to Seattle, Ryan?
I did not. I wasn't allowed to.
Right. Me neither. Your parents wouldn't let you go, right?
No,
Was
no,
that the
it's a
situation?
big ask
Yeah. It's
at
a long way
15.
from Maryland. Yeah.
Yeah. But I watched it, and I remember very specifically seeing the coverage in either Time Magazine or Newsweek, and there's a photo of a riot cop kicking a dude in the stomach, and the dude was dressed like I dressed, and I just identified with it and was like, oh, these people are like my people, the ones protesting. Like this is a real thing. And so I got really involved. I went to all the protests after that and started to, I was already somebody who would have considered myself an anarchist or something like that at the time, but I hadn't done much reading or understanding outside of sort of the lyrics of punk songs. So
That
my
was a
exposure
nice
to
place to start. The lyrics
definitely
of punk songs, and a lot of other people. Did you know a lot of other people who were discovering sort of politics through that kind of process? Or I mean, like I know
Oh, yeah.
I've heard you talk about the scene in Towson, Maryland, in the suburb of DC. That you, it's not really a suburb, more a suburb of Baltimore,
Suburb of
right?
Baltimore, yeah,
Yeah.
Towson. Yeah.
Towson, it's pronounced, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm being exposed as a not from the area, but what was it a really alienating environment to grow up in that particular suburb? I mean, the suburb I grew up in at the time that I grew up in there, I felt like totally alone in terms of being a little left-wing teenager. But what was it
Mhm.
like in Towson?
Well, it was alienating like any other suburb is alienating, but I wouldn't consider it particularly alienating. I think I was pretty lucky to grow up on a block with a real community, like kids hanging out together. I could walk into my friend's house and talk to his parents if I needed something, so I definitely had that kind of thing. I was definitely bullied, at high school. I think I had the unique experience of in middle school being kind of a popular kid and being with a crew once I got to 8th grade, not when I was in 6th grade, but how it goes. But when I was in 8th grade, I was kind of like not a popular kid like a football player would have been, but I was popular and I picked on people with my friends sometimes.
Mm,
And I remember the one time in my life where I really just tried to like pick a fight with a kid because I like, didn't like him, but it was just me being an asshole.
mm.
And I got to 9th grade in high school and immediately, I was punk rock by then and I just got picked on like crazy. And I just remember like the gut punch of being like, I did this to someone this one time. Like I remember the scene specifically. So
Mm.
there was this combination of like this typical sort of like Hollywood high school drama at a time when the world was exploding with anger against neoliberalism and capitalism, and sort of seeing the way I was treated and the way I had treated people as just a microcosm, I think. So I think I got a sense of that. And I saw friends of mine in high school who were gay and queer and like just like outcasts, just getting bullied by the same people. And those were the folks I hung out with, So yeah, in Towson, I was very much, it was all punk rock politics. So I came into the scene super political already because I really, the Dead Kennedys were, I was in middle school and I'm hearing the Dead Kennedys and getting politicized. So when I started hanging out like and loitering with the other punks, I was already political. And so a few of the older guys and women took me under their wing. And, I sort of became the new sort of political leader in the punk scene. And so when I started going to the protests, it wasn't, there was a political scene, but I was very much responsible for curating that scene and growing it and bringing a lot of people into it. And like, I think I can very safely say for any of my old friends listening that I definitely was like doing things as a teenager that really politicized people in a way that, hopefully will be lifelong.
Did you
Yeah.
feel like what was going on was like being reproduced in lots of different towns at the same time, or was there? Yeah, it was that kind of
Oh yeah.
vibe. Like,
It was
yeah, because
everywhere. Yeah. It was kind of what was going on.
it was something that it was sort of in the air, not just for the subculture, but also for other kids at high school at the time. Would you say?
I don't think for other kids, it wasn't like, at the time it felt like the biggest thing in the world. And, obviously there was big parts of it, especially in Latin America and Southeast Asia, but, it was a global movement. But in the US, it wasn't like mainstream. We were on the news, but, then you see something like the Occupy movement or Black Lives Matter, and you're like, okay, this is what it looks like when a movement becomes mainstream and normal. And, like, it's weird to meet somebody who doesn't at least sympathize with one of those two things. For us, it was definitely different, but it was popular enough that anytime you have the thing you believe in referenced in mainstream, places, it's very easy to talk to people about it and bring people into it, And I do think that
Mm.
what we were demanding and the things we were protesting about were not much different from some of the things we're seeing today. It's just that we were doing it at a time when the rest of the world was well aware of the situation, but in the US, we were still in like the .com heyday, and people were, how could you possibly be protesting against this? This is the greatest thing we've ever given to the world. And then, 2008 hit, and suddenly people were like, oh, it's this. Yes, that's it. That's the same system.
That's what they were
Yeah.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although there
Yeah.
was that time when it was commonly like any town you went to, you could find a group of people that was at least talking about the existence of the World Trade Organization, right?
Yep.
And although it wasn't necessarily like a mass movement the way we've seen recently in that sense, but it was kind of a little bit of everywhere, right? And
Yeah, I mean, for you and I to tour back then, it was pretty easy because you could just find, the activist center, the info shop in that town, and it was basically the same group of people that I was, growing up with in my town. And you find your sort of equivalents, and they organize your show, and but yeah, it was pretty common, and it wasn't just really like the college towns; it was a lot of random places. Yeah.
how did I'm just, and it was right around early on, like that you and a bunch of other musicians started up some form of a collective or a, I don't know if that's the right term, but a grouping, a network, and was that was really early on. You were still a teenager at the time, right?
I must have been, yeah, because Riot Folks started in 2004. So I think I started thinking about it in 2003 and just being like, because I started to run into other musicians making the kind of music that you and I are both making, but who were like in my sort of scene and my age range and sort of in the same circles and somewhat at the same level of politicization, give or take. I think like Ethan Miller and Kate Boverman were a little older than me and had already been involved in some things, but like Tom Frampton, I met him in Quebec City at a big protest in the middle of a tear gas situation, and then like a year later, a friend of mine was like, "Hey, have you ever heard Tom Frampton?" And I was like, "I don't know." And he played me this like punk folk singer, and I was like, "Is this the same Tom that I know?" And so we got in touch, and I was like, "You're making folk music. I'm making folk music, you know." And Mark Gunnery, I had grown up right nearby him. We met around the time of Seattle, so we had been playing music together and whatnot. So it was just a matter of kind of bumping into enough people, and almost all at protests. I mean, I met Ethan in the Convergence Center in Miami at the big Free Trade Area of the Americas protests. I met Evan, I think, in Miami as well. But then we met again later at the Democratic Convention protests in Boston in 2004. So I basically ran into people at conferences and at big protests and kind of networked and started talking about banding together. But yeah, I mean, we had like, in retrospect, it's kind of funny because we had absolutely no business plan. And I mean, no business plan at all. Not like our business plan was bad. We had zero plan. We had a logo, and we were like, we have a logo,
A logo. What more do you
right?
need,
Like,
right?
yeah, we're anarchists. That's all we need, right? We're just a thing. So really, if you want to be like real about what Riot Folk was, it was a brand, like a voluntary collection of people under a brand, but with very little other infrastructure whatsoever.
I love the way it became it basically, for a lot of people anyway, I'm not sure how many, it became just a genre. I mean,
In
it's
Europe, especially, yeah.
in Europe, you'll hear people
Yeah.
talk about Riot Folk and with no idea that this is that this was ever like, something other than just a term for a sort of a
Right.
subgenre. Yeah.
And it's funny because I was in Portland, Oregon, where you're at, playing a show back in 2003. I think it was a place called It's a Beautiful Pizza, maybe.
Sounds
And
familiar.
it
Yeah.
was my first show in a pizza place, which was cool. But on the flyer, the person who was making the flyer had never met me, didn't know my music. She was just a friend of someone else who was like,
Mm.
"Hey, can you design the flyer?" She said, "Yeah." And she said, "What kind of music do you make?" And I was like, "I don't know. It's protest folk music." And she was like, "Well, play me a song or two." So I played her a song, and then I saw the flyer and it said Riot Folk from Baltimore. So that's
Ah,
where that term came from.
I love it. That's so
Yeah.
it's like kind of crowdsourced. I mean, the whole thing in a way. I mean, that's a terrible term. What's the term we used to use? I can't remember now. I've been influenced too much by the corporations. I don't know what the vocabulary. We had other terms for these things before, but
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know. But yeah,
it
what's cool
also
about it is that like the term Riot Folk it was very accurate because I was literally like we were meeting each other pretty much at pre-planned riots. These days we wouldn't call them riots. They were pretty relaxed compared to what the kids are up to now. But
yeah.
back then we called that a riot. Yeah.
Right. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. There was a lot less stuff burning back then. It was more
Yeah.
like if you dared to like pull a fence out of the ground, then or knock over a newspaper stand, then you're
Yeah, that was a
really,
riot. Yeah.
yeah.
Now that's like that happens at a vigil.
Totally. The idea of the Riot Folk Collective, though, it also seemed like it was kind of mirroring a lot of the sort of organizing, I guess, methodology that was going on at the time with like indie media and these different kinds of networks that are now, I'd say in 2020, 2021, we now, they all refer to themselves as blocks, which is funny because it used to be just the Black Bloc was the only block. And then there was other blocks. And I remember in some protests that then they started talking about, the pink block and green block and different
Mhm.
blocks. And now the term block means what we used to mean by, I don't know what exactly, but it's not, it's a broader, much broader term now, I guess, at least in the Portland protest scene. I don't know if this is a
Mm.
national or global phenomenon, but it was this kind of like, I mean, you were basically also immersed in this kind of in the ideas of sort of horizontal organizing. I mean, it kind of seemed like a natural thing to do in a way in that
Yeah.
milieu. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was definitely the same language that was being used in the political scene. So it dovetailed with it very, very effectively. And that was very much what we were doing. I mean, we were not, I don't think any of us at the time, I think maybe since then, different of us have thought of ourselves in relation to music differently. But I don't think any of us were like, we're going to have a music career out of this. It was just sort of like, I do this thing and I'm part of the political scene. And so I'm going to go around and do this thing in the political scene. Uh, it was many, many years before I played a show at anywhere other than something tied to the political scene, a conference or info shop or at a university as part of a group. Yeah.
I think this whole like just putting you and your life and times as a musician at that particular stage in this particular context of like the political activist scene at the beginning of the collapse of the music industry is basically, or actually several years into the collapse of the music industry is when you started your, we can't, I mean, if career would be the wrong term when you're playing music for activist crowds and you're basically avoiding sort of paying gigs in a sense. But I wonder, like, that whole navigating those waters at that time. I mean, it's just so many different influences and such a confusing mix of influences. And I just wonder what like how did you? I know you guys I mean, you were trying to deal with this whole question of being a musician and in the context of a social movement, and you had a lot of. I mean, I don't know how much of when you look back at that time, like how much of the contradictions that you were dealing with, do you feel like were just like as important as they felt at the time, or do you look at it more like, oh, I was really trying to figure out these like social relations within the context of a movement that maybe wasn't as important as the
Yeah.
bigger picture. You know what I mean? I don't know.
The latter,
I'm not phrasing
definitely.
this well, but
No, I
you know.
understand. I mean, the the issues that like we dealt with as these young musicians, I think are kind of laughable now in a way, right? Like the not understanding the difference between profit and income, for instance. Big thing you learn when you're over 30. You start to think about that.
Paying
You
the
know,
rent doesn't mean you're a capitalist. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And I think our avoidance of money, I don't know. I don't know had we had a business plan back then, would it have been different? But I know that one of our inspirations, not Riot Folk, but like me in the punk scene was Crass. And Crass, they were DIY, they did all this stuff themselves, but they put out that first record and it took off in the punk scene and they made a lot of money from it. What they did with that money is they put out a bunch of other bands and they helped build the scene. So they gave back, but they weren't just like, no, don't pay for our record. They were like, oh, we can actually use this money to like further the work that we're doing. So maybe we could have done that. I think that was sort of originally the plan with Riot Folk, was like hypothetically we could like fundraise for the movement, but then we didn't have a plan to bring in money, and we in fact like scoffed at and avoided it. But then the rest of it, yeah, I think that looking back, the period of time during Riot Folk for me was also a period like it was self-discovery. I was also like learning how to be an activist and learning how to be a musician and learning politics and all of this stuff. So when I listen to some of my old songs, they don't sound like authoritative the way that I would try to write a song today, where I'm like, if I'm writing about it, I'm writing about it because I understand it enough to offer what I believe is an important piece of it. But, some of my songs back then were just sort of like almost me kind of asking questions publicly, but that's what the people listening to it were doing too. So it wasn't like a teacher student dynamic. It was more like all the students in the room and one of them had a guitar and whatever. So, but we were trying to write songs. I mean, not even trying, like I was just writing songs organically that were built on the conversations and the experiences the listener was having. So it was definitely a very intimate sort of music scene, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then like so much in keeping with the sort of vibe of I guess what we maybe call the folk punk scene in terms of the sort of the way the way artists that kind of we now I guess I'm not sure if we were using the term back then, but the artists we now characterize with that subgenre term are often artists that are, whether they're overtly political or not, they're telling personal narratives, and like it's a personal narrative thing that is sort of first person is kind of the default position for a lot of the songwriting, and it's yeah, I love.
Do you know?
Do
you know Hessel in the Netherlands? Have you ever met Hessel?
Hessel.
Yeah, he's obsessed with political music. You would probably remember him.
Right. No, I don't think
he's
so.
like the other person I've met that's as obsessed as I am with political music. And when I first met him, he was like, I love your music. And I made you this like flash drive with 16,000 songs on it of like, just my selection. I was like, this guy's like me. But Hessel told me that one of the things he loved about Riot Folk was that he felt like other folk singers in the past, and, I think he's especially referencing people like Phil Oakes, they were very much like looking at the world as sort of as journalists, and our music was like, like you just said, it was very personal. It was like songs about me within the context of the politics, and there was a very, which is maybe a kind of a punk thing, but it's also a very modern thing. Like it's more, in a way, it's more individualistic than what was happening in the 60s, but also it's a little more honest. Like there's an emotional element to it that maybe you didn't find in a lot of the past stuff. But I had never thought about that because it wasn't not intentional. I was just a kid writing music. So, but when you think about it, like ethnomusic, as an ethnomusicologist or something, you can be like, this is very unique because it's doing something a little bit different. And,
Yeah, it really, I mean, I think it, to the extent that anything deserves a subgenre term for itself, I mean, I think, the term was earned because it was used before. You didn't even try, you weren't trying to create a subgenre. It's just when it becomes a subgenre and people start using the term as a subgenre, I think that speaks for itself in terms of, I mean, it's kind of like a song that becomes, sort of everybody starts singing it without knowing who the author was, it's that sort of thing. It's I would say a glowing success, whether you are even trying to do that or not. It's a glowing success in terms of the folk process, or what Pete Seeger would refer to as the folk process.
The folk process, yeah. And it's weird because somebody like you, like there were 9 of us in Riot Folk. It started with 8, and then Shannon Murray was added in. But we had very different influences, right? Like Mark Gunnery was way more likely to be listening to Leonard Cohen or Bikini Kill and then writing a folk song. I was way more likely to be listening to you or Phil Oakes or something very similar to what I was trying to do. You know, I was not very creative with my my input and output. I don't even know what Tom and Ethan were listening to, right? Like, and Brenna, obviously, I mean, Brenna's guitar playing is just incredible and so unique and so interesting. Like, we were having all sorts of different influences. And so it feels weird to have, like, when I saw Riot Folk as a genre, I was like, okay, but like, is David Rowick's Riot Folk? Because like, I basically do what he does. It's not that much different. I'm not even that, you know, like I'm punk. Like I was punk back then, far punker than I am now, but I wasn't making punk music. I was making folk music. It was not, Tom Frampton was making punk folk. I was just making folk music in the punk scene.
I hear you. Yeah.
You know?
Although it's kind of interesting because like with your percussive right hand, you know, I don't know what that is exactly, but it's certainly something that, you know, that I do, that Ani DeFranco does, that you know, and I mean, I think I probably got it from her.
Jim Page does it lightly.
Jim Page has his own, I mean, you know, and we're both so influenced by Jim Page. And I think sometimes I can tell like, oh yeah, Ryan's been listening to a lot of Jim Page lately, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
It's just, I can tell that in my own songwriting all the time.
Yeah,
And I wonder if he listens to me and thinks, you know, that is so
hello, Jim, if you're watching, thank
like,
you.
Jim, like, I wonder if he ever wonders, like, can these people ever just like start doing something that's not like basically a Jim Page derivative, you know? But no, I'm if I can ever just write another Jim Page song, I'll be very proud.
Yeah, if you see me putting a second capo on the guitar, you know who I've been listening to.
I haven't done that yet. I haven't gone down the second capo rabbit hole the way Jim did a long time ago. I don't know. He never likes retuning his guitar. I always figure that's easier than the second capo, but you know. Ryan, one of the many things that we have in common is, you know, I mean, I know a lot of other organizers and a lot of other musicians who kind of like, I would sort of associate with one particular social movement or another, or a particular place or another, but you know, well, East Coast generally, but you know, you're just as immersed, at least in the anti-war movement as in the global justice movement, as in the solidarity with Arab uprisings and the Kurdish uprising. And I wonder, like, I mean, for me, being, you know, I guess a couple decades older or so, when I was already touring and sort of really kind of immersed in the global justice movement when 9/11 happened. And it was just like, for a lot of people who are really had been kind of in this milieu for years, it was a kind of a shocker. And I guess my background was already kind of also in the anti-war movement, but I noticed at that time it was basically like a 9.0 on the Richter scale kind of earthquake in terms of what it did to the global justice movement. And I wonder what your recollections of, I know we're halfway through and I'm still back 20 years ago, but what are your recollections of 9/11 and what that did to the global justice movement?
That's the logical jump off point. Yeah, I mean 9/11 was really, it was an incredible political moment for the world. For me, you know, back then it was definitely, I was really angry that it happened, largely because I felt like it had just sabotaged the entire movement that I was part of, that was fighting for global justice. And it gave like a really credible excuse to the US government to clamp down on domestic dissent. You know, and obviously it gave the US this blanket excuse to launch wars. So we went from feeling like we were on the front foot to feeling like we were on the back foot. And it was scary, you know. I mean, not scary because I thought a plane was going to fly into my house, but scary because I got visited by the FBI. We would get followed. We would get photographed. Friends of mine got visited by the FBI. It became pretty scary those first few years in the political movement, especially when you're writing provocative songs. And, you know, it's not like I was just playing shows and then going home. I was like hanging out with people that ended up in prison for environmental terrorism and animal enterprise terrorism and all these things. I mean, these were people I knew. So it was scary. And then we went to war. So first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. So there was no other option for anyone in the movement except to fall into the anti-war movement. It's kind of like you might be on the front foot on something, and then all of a sudden you have to defend like the basic tenets of democracy, even though it feels all like you're moving backwards. But I mean, look, I'm a big soccer player, and offense and defense switches very, very quickly. And sometimes you're doing both at the same time, and sometimes you're completely defending, and that's just what you have to do because you can't try to shoot a goal until you're up the field. So it's very easy in soccer to recognize that. It's very hard in politics. But
in
yeah.
Jonathan Smucker's book on activism, he talks about the 80-20 rule, which is sort of more or less like you should be on offense 80% of the time and defense 20% of the time as a general rule, which I mean, as a general rule, I thought that was a brilliant little formula.
Yeah.
Actually,
if I could interview like politicized soccer coaches about the intersections of soccer theory and politics, I would start an entire podcast about it. But there's so many.
Have you read the book How Soccer Explains the World?
Yeah,
Wonderful.
Yeah.
How did you get introduced to the politics of soccer? Just to go off on a
Touring
very
in
related tangent. It's touring Europe.
Of course. Yeah.
Which team was it? What was the beginning of it? Was it a St. Pauli or Celtic or?
Yeah, it wasn't even St. Pauli. It was Celtic, honestly. But it was also just hanging out with people because I grew up playing sports. I was like a really, good baseball player. I'm extremely fast. I'm quick. I'm fairly athletic, but I was a skateboarder by the time I was cool enough to hate baseball and stuff, So, but then when I discovered soccer, not just in the context of politics, which is very important for me that, you can be a sports fan and an athlete and be part of like a social scene that's not horrible. That's pretty cool. But then it was just honestly the sport itself. I was like, this is incredible. It's so strategic. It's so tactical. It's so fast paced. It's exhausting. And it's so simple in a way, But all the politics, the political overlaps with soccer are so many when you come to talk about questions of strategy and questions of ego and teamwork and, there's just so much going on there, but another time we can go into that. But
when did you first get over to Europe? How did that happen?
Yeah. So actually it was right around that time. So we have the 9/11 attacks, the wars start. I get very involved in the anti-war movement. Obviously the anti-war movement in the US was a lot bigger than the movement around the corporate globalization because it was a little easier to find entry points if you actually didn't believe in large systemic changes to the economy. And so that was going on for a few years, but we were still sort of holding on to like the summit protests around the big corporate globalization, the big three, the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. But then in addition, back then the Group of Eight, which I don't even know if they meet anymore, but the G8, the World Economic Forum, some of these other things. So I had gone to Scotland in 2005 to protest against the G8 meetings up in the north of Scotland. And so
that was so fun. Sorry.
I didn't even leave the freaking campsite. I was, but either way, some of the riot folks, we set up a little tour in the Netherlands and around the UK and Ireland before we went up to Scotland. So that was my first exposure. Like going to the Netherlands was really like, I don't want to say it was life-changing, but it was somewhat life-changing. I mean, the flyer from our show there is still in the basement at Onderbroek in Nijmegen from 2005. But I was just
how
like,
was it life-changing? What was it like discovering that? Was this your first time in a actual functional social democracy?
Yeah, I mean, that
it's quite that is life-changing, isn't it? I mean, for me, it was like first time seeing a functional society. Like, whoa, where's all the dysfunction? Where's all the poverty and misery visible? Although you could find some if you looked.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it was partly being like people being like, oh yeah, you can just go take the train there, and I'm like, okay, what time does the train leave? And they're like,
every 5 minutes,
all the time. And I'm like, should I where can I check the schedule? And they're like, just go to the train station, get a train. It's like, where I come from, there could be one train that day. And if you miss it, you got to get it the next day. So I remember touring the US by Greyhound, and literally, like, I play a show in somewhere in South Texas, and there's one Greyhound that the next morning. You got to get there at 7 o'clock in the morning if you're going to get to your show on time. But no, for the Netherlands, it was more seeing the European squat scene, the sort of leftovers from the autonomous movement, and how they had, like, just the level of culture of sustainable cultural institutions that had been created, and cultural practices that just had been there for decades
and they just get passed down, right? And
yeah, it's amazing. Because
well,
in
it
here,
isn't it amazing? I mean,
absolutely.
just to emphasize this point for people who are like, think that we're just talking nonsense. I mean, traveling around Europe for year after year after year, everywhere I go, they're playing your music, and they're playing my music. But all these places that I'm playing in, they're fans of these squats. Your name comes up constantly, and they're. But what is so? I mean, to me, that's not surprising given the kind of music you do. But what is so interesting about that is that this continues 20 years or whatever, 10 years later, and that kind of continuity just seems not to happen so much in the United States, but in
Yeah,
a
you
lot
don't
of
see
these
it here.
countries in Europe it does, right?
Yeah, I mean, I go to the Netherlands and I'm like, oh, how's Bart doing? And they're like, young Bart or old Bart? Because old Bart's still around, right? Like,
I know Bart.
here, yeah. So here you might have like the
Great
four
cook.
old guys in the punk scene, but especially in Germany, I mean, you meet old punk rockers. They've been around and they're still living in a squat. They're still in the same scene. There are more, and that's because there's a like a what's the word? Like an infrastructure, right? They like people create venues and the venues stay, and you don't have to rediscover, like, you and I know very well when you try to tour the US, it's like, okay, got to map out if any of those venues still exist. And then I got to find new ones and new contacts. Europe, I could still have the same person from 10 years ago in the same town who's like, oh yeah, I'm still booking shows.
And that's been your experience with touring the U.S. Probably since you've been touring the U.S. Is that it's the venues are constantly disappearing and all that? Because, like, for me, I think I was just kind of I got into this on the tail end of before the housing crisis. Back when. I mean, it was still a crisis for some people, but a lot of those venues, there wasn't quite the turnover, like, and it was more practical, and there was a lot more economics that was practical in the whole thing. But that your experience with touring in the US, have you ever actually had a tour that where you came home with more money than you left with, like enough to pay
No,
rent?
not in the US.
Yeah,
Definitely
not
not
in
in
the
the
US,
US.
but in Europe,
Unless I
it's
got
more.
a lucky university gig or something like that. And
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, touring the US, the last few times I toured the US, which was years ago, I really didn't have a very good time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not blaming people for that. Like, our country it's a really tough place to create these kind of lasting cultural institutions. And it's a lot easier to just hop over to Europe and do a tour and know that you're going to break even. And but then on the other hand, like, I don't want to say it's a selfishness, though I'm sure there's selfishness involved. Like, go to fucking Europe and I can go to all these different countries and see all this new stuff, meet new people, learn new things. I mean, I'm obsessed with learning, and I learn mostly in person. So, I would go to Europe and I'd be in Germany. I would be reading a book about the autonomous movement. I'd go to, Spain, and I'd be reading a book about Spain, and I'd really just try to immerse myself. And then one of the things that I realized many years later with all of those experiences was I developed a much better understanding of just, like, not specific, like, I'm not, I can write an entire concept album now about, the Italian partisan movement. No, but, like, I understand the human condition better. I understand the condition, like the political condition better as a universal. I learned more about how the world functions and interacts, how different movements see each other. And, I think as a creator, as somebody who puts content out, that's a very important kind of experience to have, so that I can be a little more rounded in my understanding of reality. But then also, now that I have a podcast, I can harness all these contacts I've made,
Right.
and I can
Yep.
start to actually, create hour-long episodes that are mutually beneficial for the movements they participate in and for my listeners, and all of that.
Yeah, that's I wanted to get to that podcast. And what's the name of the podcast again?
It's called Hope Dies Last.
Hope Dies Last. Yeah, and people can
Named
find
after
it
that
also on
Studs
your
Terkel
website.
book.
Hope Dies. Oh, he wrote a book called Hope Dies Last. Wonderful. I love Studs Terkel, but I didn't realize he wrote a book with that title. And it's a wonderful podcast. And that is that's what Ramsey PM Press had commented about my podcast, saying, well, you travel around the world, you meet all these people, and that's who you're interviewing, and you're doing the same thing, and it's a wonderful thing to have this resource. And I used to travel and think, oh, I want to interview these people, and then I'd never get around to it, but then when the pandemic hit, it was very helpful. I mean, I got into it as you did also before the pandemic hit, but then much more so during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And Ryan, when around the time I mean, you were very deeply involved with Occupy Wall Street, as well as with the Arab uprisings that were happening during the same year, and I wonder, I want to know how you first ended up traveling to the Arab/Kurdish world, and also what your experience was with that and the intersection of that and Occupy Wall Street. I know it's a huge question. It's way too big a question, but just
but
do
it's
what
not
you
a
can
weird
with
question.
It's not. I didn't think you'd think it was totally weird. Like, yeah, big, but not weird.
You and I are definitely among the American folk singers that write a lot of stuff about the Middle East. So.
Yeah.
I think you were, when I was young, I mean, you were writing lots of songs about Palestine. I didn't write a song about Palestine until I was a lot older. It was one of those things that I didn't know a lot about it, to be honest. And I didn't try to know a lot about it because I was trying to know a lot about Afghanistan and Iraq. And, in the social scene I was in, you have the people who are like obsessed with the Zapatistas, and then you have the people who are obsessed with Palestine. And then like very, very few people knew a lot about other things. So I was sort of like, well, I'm really interested in what's happening in Iraq. I'm going to try to become very knowledgeable about that. And if I have a question about Palestine, I'll ask a friend, So, but it was through the anti-war movement. I mean, I got very involved with the anti-war veterans whom I met through a music tour I did. And I just started working with them really, really, really closely and intimately for years, helping them organize and strategize and recruit and all of this stuff. And we did some pretty crazy shit back then. But and so as part of my work in the anti-war movement, I tried to make a point, along with a few friends, of just like really trying to understand what is happening in Iraq. What is the resistance? What are these organizations? And you start to learn, like, this is not a united front against the Americans fighting for a democratic, independent Iraq. Some of these groups are extremely problematic politically. Getting funded by other right-wing authoritarian powers. Most Iraqis don't necessarily love these groups. It's just kind of like, you want guns, they got guns, and now they run the community. So now you have to deal with them. There was ethnic cleansing going on in Iraq in 2005 and 6. And the U.S. was kind of standing by as it happened, but the U.S. wasn't perpetuating it necessarily. We created the conditions that allowed it to happen. But you just start to realize, like, okay, the Iraqi perspective on this is very different from the U.S. left perspective, which is like the U.S. has done everything. Everything's the U.S. If they leave, everything's fine, right? And so that was kind of my entry into sort of a deeper study of Middle Eastern politics. And so when the Tunisian Revolution happened, I remember Sarah Lazar, a good friend of mine who was part of the Civilian Soldier Alliance with me and who's now over at In These Times. We talked on the phone and we were just like, this is about to be huge. Like, this is going to spread, because we sort of were following things, and then it did, and we saw what happened. And it was all, it was very exciting. It was like after this whole period of time of this narrative around like the U.S. democratizing the Middle East and bringing democracy and all of this stuff, complete failure. It only resulted in just absolute horror in places like Iraq. And now you have a whole generations of Arab youth redefining what democratizing the Middle East is and means, and who does it. And I mean, it was so influential. I was in Europe when Occupy started. I remember I was in Sweden, and I was telling people, we're like, what's this protest going to be, this Occupy thing? And I remember being like, it's going to be bullshit. These kids are going to sleep in the park. That's not how you start a movement. I was very, very smart at the time.
Attitude. Yeah.
And I was like, they're not even organizing. They're just putting stuff out in a magazine, whatever. And I was obviously completely unaware of where the kids were at. And then I remember I'd gone for 2 weeks around. People were asking about it, and I was like, "It's bullshit. It's going to be bullshit." And then I get to France at the end of my trip, and I look online, and it was the day after the arrests on the Brooklyn Bridge, and everyone I knew, my brother, kids I went to school with, completely apolitical people, everyone was talking about and sympathizing with Occupy Wall Street. And I was like, holy shit, what is happening?
And the
then I
press
flew.
coverage, right? That was amazing. The
Yeah,
press
it was
coverage.
everywhere. So I flew home. I flew into New York, thankfully. So I went straight to Zuccotti Park, ran into Jonathan Smucker there, and just was kind of like, this is wild. What in the freak is? And then it was everywhere. By the time I got home, every town had an Occupy, and so it was definitely I had been in Wisconsin that February. During the Egyptian Revolution, they've just overthrown Mubarak, and then these people end up sort of accidentally occupying the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin for 3 weeks. So I flew out there. Tom Morello had gone out there and performed, and then he texted me and he was like, dude, you need to go to Madison.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, if Tom Morello is telling me to go, that's never happened before. It probably won't ever happen again. I'll take him up on it, So I raised a little bit of money from friends, and I went and documented it and stuff. But yeah, it was very obvious, I think, that by that summer that we were entering like a really historic time period. And the Arab Spring obviously was the biggest piece of that. But I think for the listener, just to tie it all together to now, I mean, we're still in that period. The period of time that we exist in was really like inaugurated with the economic crisis, but the period of resistance was inaugurated with the Tunisian Revolution. And I really credit Mohamed Bouazizi and the people who rose up in Tunisia with really sparking something in the world. Yeah,
spark is the right word for that powder
indeed.
Cake. Yeah. And then but you mentioned Tom, and that was something I wanted to. I think we're maybe backing up in time a little bit here, but people were.
What is time, David?
Exactly. The fifth. What is it? The fourth dimension. It's amazing time, isn't it? I mean, when you go to a place and you know the history of the place a little bit, you see a lot more when you look around, right? But when you were doing these tours with involving Iraq veterans against the war, and how did those tours come together, and how did you first meet Tom Morello? I think these things might be related.
Yeah, well, it's funny. We were playing a Riot Folk show in New York with, God, it was a great lineup. It was like this band Bread and Roses from Boston. I think Eric Peterson, rest in peace, was there. Somebody from one of the guys from Leftover Crack was performing, and then a bunch of Riot Folk people. And we had gotten emailed by this dude called the Night Watchman from LA. And he was like, oh, I think Tom says he tried to join Riot Folk. I'm not sure if that's true. It's very possible. But we weren't, there's no reason to join it, It's like because it was barely a thing anyways, but it was cool. It was a cool logo. So he says he tried to join it, but either way, he was definitely trying to like link up with us and was like, I'm making protest folk music. And there was like a theory that this was like Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine, but we didn't really know until he's like, my other band is in New York and I'd love to swing by your show. And we were like, Audio Slave is playing at like the fucking arena tonight. So this is probably who this is. And then, Tom shows up looking like a character of Tom Morello. And we're like, yeah, that is the guitarist of Rage Against the Machine right there. Like, how about that? And yeah, I was like, at first I was a little like, I don't do celebrity worship. That's not who I am. So I was just in the basement and everyone was kind of mingling and being like, oh my God, Tom Morello. And I was just chilling downstairs and Tom came up and he's like, you're Ryan, right? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, I love your fucking music. And I was like, thanks, man. And then, yeah, we just became friends on a fairly equal foot like that. And, I think Tom and I have always had an understanding that I am very tied to the grassroots political activism in the left world, and that I understand the place for culture and politics. And so I was very careful, in not exploiting my relationship with him, but in tapping him when it was necessary and bringing him in to help out. So when I met these Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, who I met at a protest. They were smoking cigarettes and looked really bored at this really bad, very liberal anti-war march. And I went over and I think I bummed a cigarette from one of them. And then we started talking and I realized that they're all veterans and we were all super cynical about the protests. We all had like links in the punk scene. And, this was Garrett Reppenhagen. He's now the head of Veterans for Peace. It was, folks who were early members of Iraq Veterans Against the War. And I was like, I've got this tour coming up in a month. I'm going around the Midwest for a month doing, I've got all these counter recruitment activists talking about getting recruiters out of the schools. I'm going to play music at night. Son of None was part of it. Head Rock was part of it. And they were like, dude, can we join? Can we join? Can we come? And I was like, we could have you speak every night about the war. So we did this crazy month-long tour where these veterans who'd never, little did I know, first night, Steve comes up to me, so what do you want me to talk about? And I was like, just like give the, your talk. And he was like, I've never talked about the war. And I was like, whoa, oh, fuck. So that's what we did. And we just made the road. And Tom Morello came in at the end and played 2 shows in Chicago. And that began, a endless bond between him and the veterans movement. And he's been there for them and done a lot of work to support them since then. And that was for me and Tom was also the beginning of our working relationship, and sort of we pulled off some successful things together, and we're often walking in the same circles, so we kept doing that.
And you are currently now actually working like a 40-hour a week kind of job, right? For Common Cause, is it?
No, I'm at Public Citizen.
Public Citizen. Well, I don't know why I get these things confused. Public Citizen sounds so similar, like the same generation, I guess.
Same vibe. Same vibe.
Great.
Yeah. And so ironically, I came full circle to my political development, and I'm now working at Global Trade Watch, where I work on combating neoliberal trade policies.
It's really the same kind of stuff that motivated you 25 years ago when you were a kid, this kind of global inequality and the question of...
it's wild. I was talking to, Barbara Dane, the founder of Paradigm Records. I interviewed her a few weeks ago about her life and times and the record label. And one of the things I thought was so interesting about her is that she was politicized in the 40s in Detroit, but then ended up, in the 60s anti-war movement, but with much more political maturity and age maturity than a lot of the other people. And it shows, it shows in the way that she approached the politics of the 60s. And I was talking to her about, the thing I realized, that there's these like micro generations of politics, and sort of the time period in which you're politicized tends to stick with you for a very long time. So the politics of the anti-globalization movement, I'm very much a product of that. And it will always be a sort of central part of my outlook in life politically. It are the slogans of that movement, I think.
Well, I would just have to say, as somebody who came into the global justice movement, or in my 30s, that even though I came up during the time of the anti-interventionist movement in Central America and the anti-nuclear movement, to me, when the global justice movement came around, for me, it was like, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And I had already been reading Noam Chomsky since I was 12. So I knew that's what I was looking for, because that's what he was writing about all the time, along with a lot of other things. But clearly, like this idea of everybody coming together, to tackle, the same corporations that were causing the wars, destroying the forests, and running the sweatshops. It was just such an obvious, when it started coming together, it was like, so I mean,
I totally like it. It's so important for people to also know that movement, like the movement against corporate globalization, so many of the people that were in leadership positions, whether that was like heads of organizations or people whose words were being read and were being listened to, like especially in the US, so many of them came out of the movements in solidarity with Central America in the 70s and 80s, and out of the anti-nuclear movement. And, like their politics really shaped that movement. And it's something that I feel like in American history, like, people are like, oh, there's big protests, just like the 60s. Like that's our only
political
historic reference.
The
Yes.
last time protests were covered on TV.
Exactly.
In a
Yeah.
big way.
Yeah. And I remember being at a workshop at the, remember NCORE, the National Conference on Organized Resistance in the early 2000s. And I was at an intergenerational anti-war panel discussion, and intergenerational meant Iraq and Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I remember my good friend, and I'm sure a good friend of yours, Lisa Fithian, stood up and was like, I just want to point out, like, there are other generations in between these that were in anti-war movements. And like some of us in the room helped prevent a US invasion of Nicaragua. And like, I just want to throw that out there. And I was like, you did?
Yeah.
I was like, I didn't know that. So one day I'll interview Lisa about that, but I haven't gotten to
excellent. I've had Lisa on my show too.
Oh, nice. Good,
I'm
good.
a huge fan of Lisa.
What's up, Lisa, if you're listening?
Yeah. Still need to read her book, though. I think she wrote a great book on organizing. There's a lot of great books on organizing.
David, all our friends are writing books now, and we can't read them all. I have Jonathan's book. I haven't read it yet. I just read Shane Bauer's book. Finally, I've had that for a year.
Oh, good. Yeah. Luckily, Jonathan, I just tweeted his Twitter digested version of his book. He like digested it into 20 tweets, and that's.
I'll have to read that version.
It's a great version. It's really great reading. You really like think hard about each tweet. Like fantastic. Yeah.
And Jonathan was always. I mean, I was in a lot of movements with him, and obviously, I mean, I probably met him he was probably playing a concert with you when he was a folk singer back in the day. But he was always taking notes and always thinking, like he was always going one step further in thinking about the political strategy of things we were involved with. And I'm so glad that he found the time and space to put that all into a comprehensive theory. And honestly, he was the first person that I knew of long before Occupy started, who was like recognizing that we were entering this populist moment and that we were going to see a ground shift. And I don't think any of us really listened to him properly and took it seriously. And I think he was very, very accurate in his predictions.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also had the same attitude that you had for the first 2 weeks of Occupy, although I was there for the first protest because I knew some of the organizers, and I had a gig in Brooklyn the day before. And so I was there in Zuccotti Park on the 17th of September. But then I thought, oh, okay, well, everybody's going to get beaten off by the police like the last time I went to a protest in Wall Street
in New York.
And that'll be in New York. I mean, it happened before.
They'll just punch you all in the face.
Yeah, forget it. We're
throw you in a bag.
Rikers Island basement. Yeah. But then they came back. It was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. So the pandemic hit, and you got into how has the pandemic been for working for a public citizen? Has that been that's been a pretty smooth transition, I imagine, for that particular gig?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually been a lot busier because we deal with issues of supply chains and trade policy and how that affects global shortages. I mean, I had COVID-19 back halfway through the quarantine probably, and I couldn't buy a thermometer. I went everywhere. I couldn't buy a thermometer. And you're like, we were sort of sitting there going, you can't get a thermometer right now. Why can't you get a thermometer? Because they're all made in one country. Why are they made in one country? Because we wrote the rules of trade to make it as easy as possible for 3 companies to produce all the thermometers somewhere. Then
on the news, they're never talking about it like that. Like all this outsourcing happened on purpose. It's not that China just like rose up to become the global manufacturing hub.
What China did and why the US is so bitter about it is that, and not to make excuses for any of Chinese policies, but China took what was supposed to be their own exploitation under the global system and they made it work for them as a nation. A lot of other countries weren't able to do that. And the US is so pissed about it because they were like, you were supposed to have tons of sweatshops, produce cheap goods, and not grow your economy. You were supposed to be in cycles and cycles of debt like everyone else. And China figured out a way to be like, no, you know what? Actually, now we can make just a winter coat just as good as yours for a lot cheaper because it doesn't have the North Face brand on it. And we make your North Face jacket so we know how to make them. Tough luck. And then we say, that's not fair. And they say, well, wasn't fair how you built the global economy either. So tough luck. But yeah, so the pandemic at work, definitely. I mean, since last November, I mean, really since the election, but even before that, we started to raise the alarm about how the rules at the World Trade Organization are impacting the ability of countries to produce COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. And so ever since the election, India and South Africa put out a proposal to waive intellectual property rights related to COVID-19 treatments and vaccines at the World Trade Organization. So we've been, really in a significant role in that campaign. We were able to, we were part of the big push that resulted in the U.S. Switching their position, which is really historic and great. And now we're hoping that some of the other big nations, the European Union, Japan, Switzerland, Colombia, Brazil, change their position as well, so we can get vaccines produced around the world. And it's just so interesting that I remember when I was younger, coming into the movement, hearing the stories about the fight around HIV/AIDS medications and how World Trade Organization rules restricted the world from producing affordable medicines. And now it's like, this is exactly the issue. And now we're seeing it. Like, I wouldn't make a comparison between this and the AIDS HIV crisis, but they're both massive. They're both massive. And,
it does get repetitive, doesn't it? I mean, do you find yourself getting bogged down with it all in terms of emotional stability, or do you manage to stay relatively sane? I mean, the repetitiveness of it, I mean, not to mention all the death and destruction, that's the worst part, but the way it continues, the same patterns.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a lot. I don't think I deal with it in a really bad way. I'm definitely affected by it. It's definitely affected my daily mood and such. But the people that I look up to the most as political people and cultural people, I remember I was working on a construction site. I used to do construction, and I was down in a pretty rough area of Baltimore, and there was a knife fight in the street. There's like a shelter where a lot of guys come in to eat in the daytime. And there was a knife fight in the middle of the street. And I was walking towards it because I had gotten some fiberglass in my eye, and I was going to try to see if somebody in there could help me flush it out, because we had no water on the site. And these guys are trying to go after each other with one of them had a really big knife, kitchen knife. And the dude who was the manager of the place came out, this really tall black man, really commanded authority, but not in like a you have to respect me way, but in a like you do respect me way. Like he's a guy who really is like dedicated to the community, and no one would come at him, and he just got in between them and was like, y'all, you don't want to do this. And they chilled out. And I'm just like, that I want to be like what that guy is. Like, I want to have that vibe for life, where he's like, he must at times just break because things are so fucked up. But he also is like, I need to be a role model. I need to display leadership, and I need to, like, every day I have an opportunity to get people a little closer to the life they want to live, or whatever, or at least get them to back away from the edge. And politically, when I think about like movement elders who've been around and been in all these situations, especially folks who were in less comfortable places during these situations, and you see some of them and they still, like, some of them are broken and cynical, but some of them are just like, wherever you are in the world, there's work to do, and your job's to do it. Not to feel like shit about it. Just, the world's always been shitty, in a way, and it's always been amazing. You can look at any historical time period and say, that must have been awful. Right?
Here. Yeah, absolutely.
So we are in an awful time period, but I think it's very detrimental to us to be of the mindset that, like, there's never been a time this bad. And, it's like, dude, think about 1943. I mean,
the bubonic plague. 1/3 of the population of a lot of parts of the world died within the course of like a year.
Or anything. I mean, like, it's always, there's always going to be these time periods where it's just absolute tragedy everywhere, and our job is to figure out where we can plug in and help and to do it and write about it.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know where the hour went, but it's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, you too. I probably need to return some of these work calls.
Yep.
It's my lunch break. It's all good. It's my lunch break, everyone. No rules were violated during this recording.
Never.
Thanks for having me on, David. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
And
See
we'll
you
talk on
again.
my podcast sometime soon. How about it?
Oh, excellent. Absolutely.
Take
See
care,
you around.
everybody.
Bye for now.
Bye.
And thanks for tuning into this conversation with Ryan Harvey. And you can find this archived in various places, including youtube.com/drovix, or if you look for This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks for tuning in. Remember, trust your neighbors. Don't pay the rent unless you really have to. Mutual aid will get us through. And if you're local to Portland, please go to abolishevictions.org and sign up for the Portland Emergency Eviction Responses text mob. Let's get ready for the tsunami of evictions that is quite likely about to begin in a month when the moratorium ends. Okay, bye for now, everybody. See ya.